I looked Alyssa straight in the eye, my final warning. If her mother mentioned sharing my ancestral land again, I would publicly dismantle their entire illusion of wealth. I had assumed my wife was on my side. I was wrong. As the champagne was poured, I realized this wasn't a family anniversary. I was sitting at a robbery. My name is Marcus. I manage global supply chains for a living, and I'm about to correct the most expensive mistake my family ever made. In that moment, would you have chosen to rage, or would you have stayed silent to begin building a legal cage for those who tried to dismantle your legacy? Efficiency is a quiet virtue until a structural breakdown occurs. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by 5 decades of my family's architectural and logistics history, my phone vibrated with a specific high-priority notification. $300,000. It wasn't a withdrawal, it was a surgical extraction from the family trust's working capital. Looking back now, the clinical precision of that moment is what stayed with me, the way that jazz music seemed to lose its depth while the red numbers on the screen remained agonizingly sharp. Most men in my position would have caused a scene. They would have marched across that polished marble floor, grabbed a microphone, and demanded an explanation. But I've spent 15 years managing global disruptions. You do not fix a massive supply chain failure by shouting at the cargo manifest. You locate the point of failure and you bypass it. I simply sipped my bourbon and adjusted my cuff, letting the cold reality of the data settle into my marrow. I did not feel a surge of heat. I felt a freezing analytical clarity. Across the room, Alyssa was laughing. She looked radiant, her designer dress likely costing more than a year of tuition for a gifted student, but her eyes were fixed on her brother, Logan. He was leaning in, whispering something that made her smile widen with a secret, frantic triumph. It was a conspiratorial look I'd seen 1,000 times in corporate boardrooms right before a hostile takeover. That's when I realized that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. I had been the silent investor in their version of a family, a high-price subscription where I was the only one footing the bill for their collective survival. Logan finally caught my eye and raised his glass of vintage champagne. It was an arrogant, victorious gesture, the smirk of a man who believed he'd finally found the master key to my safe. He thought he'd outmaneuvered me because I was the quiet one, the man who stayed in the spreadsheets while he played at being a big-shot developer. I watched him adjust his watch, a new piece that hadn't been there 2 hours ago, and I recognized the cost. If I'm being honest, it wasn't just the money that stung, it was the sheer lack of imagination they had in their betrayal. I tried to pull up the full wire transfer details, but the ballroom's network hung a minor digital delay that felt like a physical weight. This friction was a necessary reminder that information is only power when you can verify it. As the loading icon spun on my screen, Logan began walking toward me, his chest puffed out like he already owned the ground I was standing on. He had no idea that I wasn't watching a celebration anymore. I was performing a clinical audit, and he was the primary anomaly that needed to be erased. 10 years of structural integrity can be dismantled by a single predatory intent. Looking back now, I see that I wasn't actually a son-in-law to these people. I was their primary line of credit. For a decade, I had used my position to insulate them from the consequences of their own incompetence. When Logan's first construction firm began to hemorrhage cash due to his sheer lack of operational discipline, I was the one who negotiated the debt restructuring. When his second and third ventures teetered on the edge of total liquidation, I dipped into my personal reserves to keep the lights on and the creditors at bay. I had treated Logan's survival as a non-negotiable part of our family's logistics. Michelle, too, had enjoyed the fruits of my labor with a quiet, entitled expectation. I had quietly settled her high-interest credit card debts and maintained the illusion of her upper-class lifestyle, while her own husband's estate dwindled into nothing. I did these things not because I sought their approval, but because I viewed a family as a system, one where the strongest link supports the weakest. At the time, I didn't realize that blood is often used as a weapon by the lazy to bypass the boundaries of the industrious. I was a supply chain link to them, a resource to be optimized and drained, never a man to be respected. I remember standing on the edge of the Oregon cliffs last summer, watching the waves hammer against the ancient basalt. The land felt permanent, grounded, and unmovable. It was the only thing I truly valued, a legacy left to me by my grandfather that I intended to protect for the next generation. I had brought Alyssa there to show her the site, to explain the historical significance of the soil. She hadn't looked at the horizon. She had been busy taking selfies for her followers, framing the cliffs as a mere backdrop for her digital persona. I should have seen the fracture then. Some forms of betrayal start as a simple lack of interest before they evolve into active theft. If I'm being honest, I had spent years buying peace, but you cannot negotiate with a parasitic entity. I had given them my time, my expertise, and my capital, believing I was building a foundation. In reality, I was just providing the scaffolding for a heist. It took me years to understand that family comes first is the favorite slogan of people who want to rob you with a smile. I had allowed Alyssa into my private world, giving her access to the codes and the trust documents as a gesture of absolute partnership, a luxury she had overdrafted for years. That was when my phone chimed again, cutting through the jazz of the gala. It was a formal notification from the primary lender for the Coastal Land Trust. A mortgage application for $850,000 had been finalized and approved. My lungs tightened as I scrolled through the digital summary. It was not just a loan. It was a total encumbrance of my family's land, authorized by Alyssa's status as a co-trustee, using a forged consent of majority document. She thought I'd never audit. They hadn't just stolen the $300,000 of working capital. They had mortgaged my very soul. Confidence is often just a mask for deep-seated desperation. As the jazz ensemble transitioned into a triumphant fanfare, Logan stepped onto the center stage, his presence radiating an unearned authority. He announced the launch of the Cliffside Sanctuary, a luxury eco-resort to be built on my family's ancestral land. He spoke of vision, legacy, and the strategic partnership that had made it all possible, never once mentioning that his entire business model was fueled by $850,000 of forged debt. Alyssa was standing just a few feet away, her phone poised like a weapon as she live-streamed the event to her followers. To her, this wasn't about land or family, it was about the validation of a digital audience. This is the essence of the perceived success trap, a psychological vacuum where people believe that if they look successful enough on a screen, the actual substance will somehow manifest. She and Logan weren't building a resort. They were performing a heist under the guise of an influencer's latest project. Looking back now, I see that their ambition had no floor because it was never anchored in reality. The friction of the situation became tactile when Michelle approached me, her hand resting on my arm with a grip that felt like a debt collection. She handed me a leather-bound folder, the formal management transfer for the land trust. "Sign it, Marcus," she whispered, her voice a sharp edge wrapped in velvet. "We need to finalize the permits tonight. This is for Alyssa's future, and you've always been the one we could count on to do the heavy lifting." At the time, I didn't realize how much they relied on my silence to facilitate their theft. I told them I had misplaced my fountain pen, a small, necessary delay that caused a flicker of irritation in Logan's eyes. Even in a room full of expensive watches, he could not hide the frantic impatience of a man whose house of cards was caught in a gale. I watched him look at Alyssa and then back at me, his smugness returning as he assumed I was merely being difficult before eventually giving in. He mistook my calculated pause for the paralysis of a man who had already lost. He did not understand that in logistics, you do not stop a landslide. You just ensure you are not at the bottom when it hits. Michelle leaned in closer, the scent of her perfume becoming pungent and suffocating. "Do not be selfish, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping to a register of pure, cold entitlement. "That land is as much Alyssa's as it is yours, and we aren't going to let it sit idle just because you are obsessed with the past. It needs to be turned into liquid capital, and it needs to happen now. Conflict is just a data point requiring a correction." I left the ballroom at 11:45 p.m., citing a sudden headache, a simple, plausible exit strategy that no one questioned. I did not drive home. Instead, I went to my private office and activated a network of specialists I had built over 15 years in global logistics and risk management. I did not need a family lawyer. I needed a financial strike team capable of tracing the invisible flow of stolen capital. By 3 a.m., we had completed the first phase of a covert audit. By 3 a.m., the monitoring systems I had quietly installed months ago finally delivered the full, undeniable picture of their systematic theft. We discovered that the $850,000 Logan had extracted through the forged mortgage had not gone toward construction permits or architectural fees for his eco-resort. It had vanished into high-stakes sports betting accounts and a series of high-interest bridge loans that were coming due in less than a week. Logan was not building a sanctuary on the cliffs. He was desperately trying to stop his own internal liquidation. That is when I realized that the most effective punishment is not defeating an enemy, but allowing them to secure themselves inside the very trap they designed for you. Some people mistake a lack of noise for a lack of movement, and I was moving faster than they could ever comprehend. If I am being honest, I felt a strange sense of detachment as I watched the data unfold. I was no longer a husband or a brother-in-law. I was a senior auditor dealing with a catastrophic failure in a secondary supply chain. I instructed my anonymous holding company, a Delaware entity with no public ties to my name, to begin purchasing Logan's outstanding debts from his secondary lenders. I did not want to confront them yet. I wanted to become the primary debt holder for every aspect of their lives. I wanted to be the one who owned the mortgage on Michelle's colonial house and the commercial lease for Logan's failing office. There was a moment of friction when I discovered that Logan had compromised a junior staff member at the trust office to bypass our two-factor authentication, which delayed my access to the digital ledgers for 4 hours. But in logistics, delays are simply variables to be managed. I sat in the quiet of my office watching the city lights of the Oregon coast and waited for the final piece of data to arrive. Just as the sun began to rise, I received the classified geological survey for the cliffs, the exact cliffs where Logan was planning to pour his concrete. The report was a masterpiece of hidden failure. The entire site was classified as an active subsidence zone, meaning the ground was literally sinking. It was legally and structurally impossible to build anything on that land, and any attempt to do so would result in immediate federal intervention and total financial ruin. Greed is a blinding frequency that silences all logic. 24 hours after the gala, I invited Logan to a private lunch at a quiet club where the tables are spaced for discretion and the air smells of old leather and expensive tobacco. I played the role of the exhausted, defeated strategist to perfection shoulders slightly slumped, voice lacking its usual resonance. I told him that I had reviewed the eco-resort proposal and realized that my attachment to the past was hindering the family's collective progress. Logan's reaction was exactly what I had calculated, an immediate, predatory surge of arrogance. He leaned across the table, his eyes shining with the fever of a man who thinks he has finally broken a superior opponent. He did not just want the land anymore. He wanted the total capitulation of my legacy. Looking back now, I see that the easiest people to deceive are those who are already busy deceiving themselves. I pulled a single crisp document from my briefcase, an updated personal guarantee and unconditional commitment for the $850,000 commercial loan. I explained that as the lead developer, the bank required him to provide his own certified site assessment to expedite the building permits on the cliffs. If you are the visionary behind this empire, Logan, you need to be the one the bank trusts, I said, my tone carefully neutral. There was a moment of friction when he hesitated, his gaze flickering over the dense paragraphs of legal text. But Alyssa was there, leaning in, her hand resting on his arm as she whispered about the $1 million brand deals that would follow the resort's groundbreaking ceremony. She was the catalyst for his ruin, fueled by the perceived success trap she had built for herself. She did not see a legal trap. She saw a backdrop for her next viral video. Logan laughed that rich, hollow sound of unearned victory and snatched the pen from my hand. He did not read the clause stating that he was now the sole guarantor for all liabilities, and in his haste, he signed the waiver claiming he had already verified the structural integrity himself. He did not scan the section where I, as the trust manager, was formally indemnified from any financial failure of the resort. He simply scribbled his name in large, confident strokes, anchoring himself to a sinking ship of debt. If I am being honest, I felt no joy in that moment, only the grim satisfaction of a completed correction. It took me years to understand that some people are so desperate to be seen as powerful that they will gladly walk into a cage if the bars are plated in gold. I stood up, took the signed document, and looked at my watch. The geological report sat in my office, a death warrant for his project that he would only discover when it was far too late to turn back. The groundbreaking ceremony was a manifestation of unearned pride. Standing on the edge of the cliffs, 24 hours later, Logan had arranged a fleet of heavy machinery and a crowd of local officials to witness what he called the birth of an empire. Alyssa was in the center of it all, her phone on a stabilizer, broadcasting every second of her fabricated triumph to her 200,000 followers. She was performing for the lens, her voice high and breathless as she spoke about manifesting greatness and cutting off the haters. I watched from the perimeter, a clinical observer at the edge of a landslide. I did not arrive with a megaphone. I arrived with 2 state environmental inspectors and a sergeant from the county sheriff's office. As Logan raised a gilded shovel to the cheers of his marks, I stepped into the frame of Alyssa's live stream. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous, a sudden drop in pressure that signaled the end of the vacuum they had been living in. Groundbreaking is canceled, Logan, I said, my voice carrying with the resonance of absolute legal finality. I handed him the emergency stop work order. I watched his face transition from smugness to a twitching, desperate confusion as he scanned the first page. The report from the State Geological Board was irrefutable. The land was an active subsidence zone, structurally incapable of supporting so much as a garden shed. Looking back now, I see that Logan's biggest mistake wasn't just stealing the money. It was the hubris of a visionary who thought he could skip the fundamental logistics of the very earth he stood on. Logan's manufactured composure did not just crack, it exploded. He began to roar, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was so consumed by the narcissistic injury of being exposed that he completely forgot the camera was still rolling. I spent $850,000 on this? He roared, spit flying as he gestured wildly at the sinking soil. I used your money, Marcus! I spent every cent of that trust to buy the permits and grease the palms of every official in this county. The silence that followed was a total social liquidation. Alyssa stared at her screen, her eyes wide with the realization that she had just broadcast a full high-definition confession of bribery and financial fraud to her entire digital world. The heart emojis and goals comments on her feed were replaced by a landslide of condemnation as thousands of viewers began screen recording the evidence before she could hit delete. I turned to Michelle, who was standing frozen in her vintage pearls. I did not yell. I simply handed her a crisp white envelope, a notice of debt reassignment from the Delaware shell company that now owned the defaulted mortgage on her colonial home. Your grace period has expired. Michelle, I said, my tone as clinical as a foreclosure notice. Consider this your formal notice. The foreclosure process starts tomorrow morning. Enjoy your final nights in a house you no longer own. If I am being honest, watching their world turn to ash in the Oregon wind was the most peaceful moment I had experienced in 10 years. It took me years to understand that you do not have to seek revenge when you can simply enforce the consequences. I walked past the flashing emergency lights, and the sound of Alyssa's sobbing stepped into my SUV and drove away without looking back. The cliffs are quiet now. The divorce was finalized within 6 months, a sterile, paper-heavy procedure that lacked the heat of our early years. It was less like a parting of souls and more like the decommissioning of a failed vessel. Alyssa tried to claim a portion of the cliffs during the mediation, but the ironclad prenuptial agreement, combined with her own broadcasted confession of fraud, made her position untenable. She walked away with exactly what she brought into the union: an empty vanity and a smartphone full of contacts that stopped answering her calls the moment the FBI tag started trending on her feed. Looking back now, the most striking thing wasn't the anger she felt, but her genuine, childlike confusion that the world would not simply rewrite its laws to favor her again. Logan did not face immediate prison time, but the civil judgments acted as a slower, heavier sentence. Because he had signed that personal guarantee under the arrogant belief that he was invincible, he became personally liable for the $850,000 commercial debt. Every future asset he might touch, every paycheck he might earn, is now legally flagged for collection. He lives in a small, one-bedroom apartment 2 hours inland, working an entry-level job in a field that doesn't require the general contractor's license he forfeited during the fraud investigation. Michelle was forced to sell her remaining jewelry and the vintage furniture she once used to intimidate me, all to pay for a legal defense that couldn't stop the inevitable foreclosure. She moved to a modest rental property in a neighborhood where no one knows her name, far from the country club where her story is now whispered as a cautionary tale of greed. I used the $300,000 of recovered capital to establish the Cliffside Preservation Initiative. The land will never be developed. No concrete will ever touch the soil of my ancestors. Instead, it serves as a permanent research site for environmental students, a place where the ground might be sinking, but the integrity of the mission remains solid. If I am being honest, I spent 10 years trying to reinforce a family structure that was fundamentally flawed. I thought I could engineer their character the same way I optimized a shipping route by providing enough resources to eliminate the friction of their desperation. I was wrong. Some people do not want to be supported. They want to be carried while they pick your pockets. It took the total encumbrance of my legacy for me to understand that the supply chain of trust only works if every link is willing to pull its own weight. In logistics, we learned that some points in a system are simply value sinks, places where resources disappear without any return or growth. Alyssa and her family were value sinks. My mistake wasn't my generosity, it was my refusal to acknowledge the data that showed they were never going to change. Looking back, I finally understood that by constantly solving their problems, I had only been subsidizing their betrayal. I have learned that a man's worth isn't found in the empire he builds for others to inhabit, but in the boundaries he sets to protect what is actually real. The cliffs are still there, battered by the Pacific, but standing firm, a mirror of the man I had to become to save it. Bloodlines may bring people to your table, but only integrity keeps the roof from collapsing. I am no longer a silent investor in someone else's delusion. I am the sole author of my own quiet, independent future. Have you ever experienced a moment where you realized your loyalty was actually fueling your own exploitation? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your perspective on how you finally found the strength to set that final boundary.